Thank you very much, Sarah. You're in for such a treat today. Not only is it a terrific topic, the future of the biotechnology and life sciences sector, but really a stellar panel. I'm going to let each of them briefly introduce themselves, if you would. I know everybody wants to jump right into conversation, so if you would just maybe name and title, and then we'll jump into the first question, and let me set the groundwork for that. We are obviously living in extraordinary times, both from the, well, not only from the scientific perspective, but also from the business perspective and also the policy and legislative environment. And one of the reasons that we phrased the title of our session here today is that while there have been dramatic developments over many years, it seems that we really are approaching a tipping point from many different perspectives where the landscape of our sector will really be transformed into the future. So maybe for the first question, I'd like to ask the panel to level set. Where are we now? What is the state of the life sciences sector from different perspectives? And maybe we can begin, since we're here at JP Morgan, people have had a morning, or maybe you've been here over the weekend to talk to the many participants here and just get a sense of the business and scientific framework that we're within now, which my sense is a very optimistic one, but I'd love to hear from the panel. And then after we have a conversation about that, Jim, I'll put you on notice that I will turn to you. I think many of you know Jim. He is a 24-year legislator, both at the state level and at the federal level, and I think few people know the policy and legislative environment better than he does. So maybe after the business discussion, we can jump to you to give us a sense of where things stand from that perspective. So again, let's start name and title, and Leslie, if we could jump down to you and come back around this way.
Sure. Leslie Stoltz. I head up our Bay Area Johnson & Johnson Innovation J-Labs incubator business.
I'm Paul Mignon. I head up Syneos Health, selling solutions globally.
I'm Jim Greenwood, the President and CEO of Bio for the past 13 years, having left Congress undefeated and unindicted in 2004.
And is a well-respected moderate Republican, which is great. I'm Rachel King. I'm CEO of Glycomimetics. We're a publicly traded biotech company, one program in phase 3, another about to start phase 3.
Ron Cohen. I'm founder and CEO of Accorda Therapeutics in New York. We work on neurology drugs and have an NDA pending for a new Parkinson's drug as well.
Wonderful. Well, do I have a volunteer to talk about the policy? I did tell Ron I was going to give him all the tough topics because when I reported to him in my capacity at Bio, he certainly didn't go easy on me. So if nobody volunteers, I will point my finger at the gentleman to my right.
Go ahead, give your worst. Do your worst. So what is your question?
The business and scientific environment for the biotechnology and life sciences sector today.
It's great. What's your next question?
Do you like me to give the update?
Well, I think that would be a good thing, Sarah.
Well, why don't I throw something out and you can agree or disagree? Or
go ahead, do that, and then I'll take off from there.
You know, we are here approaching the 15th anniversary of the sequencing of the human genome, and obviously there has been a lot of talk and hype about that for many, many years. I truly think that the sector is poised to really deliver on the promise of genomics. And one symbol of that is the recent approval of Luxturna, which leads directly into some policy questions around drug pricing, but what an extraordinary product. We are approaching now an era of cures rather than chronic treatments. And again, really face new and exciting possibilities for eliminating disease rather than treating it over a long period of time. So just a couple scientific points to react to. And then on the business business front, we know that there were more FDA approvals last year than in many prior years. We know that there is immense optimism about M&A due to the tax reform bill that just passed, which is going to make a lot of cash available to companies to fuel business activity. And so again, as I said, you know, as I walk into the JPM conference, I think broadly speaking, there is a sense of enthusiasm and optimism on both fronts. And let me ask the panel to agree or disagree with that.
So,
Go ahead, Ron.
yeah. So, you know, I found the title of our panel really interesting. Are we at a tipping point? And I'm going to say no, we're not. Because I don't think there is such a thing as a tipping point unless you want to talk about, at a minimum, the last century worth of progress in biology and sciences and so on that have led us to this point. Because there's an accelerating arc, and we can all see it, right? If you had to pick one point where everything just turned, you could pick Watson Crick and Rosalind Franklin back in the 50s, where the double helix was first described. I probably would pick that because if you follow everything since then in our industry and what we care about, which is discovering new ways to apply biological and other sciences to the furtherance of advancing human health and the human condition, really that was the inflection point, the big inflection point. The next big one was the one you mentioned, which was about 15 years ago, which was the original sequencing of the human genome, which took many, many years and tens of billions of dollars and just amazing numbers of people, as all these things do. And now we're already at the sub $1,000 genome that can be sequenced in a few hours. So actually, I think there is a company here that's giving lotteries for doing that for people. I saw that at the hotel. So I look at it as an arc of progress that accelerates as the various vectors of human inquiry and knowledge advance and then coalesce. Even now including artificial intelligence, machine learning, and applying that to everything else we're doing. You know, CRISPR-Cas9 and RNA interference and mRNA therapies and stem cell therapies and gene therapies. You can just tick off the list, and every day you're opening your eyes and saying, my God, look at what's going on. So in terms of the potential for actually applying all this stuff to what you said, which is to curing disease, or even to converting previously fatal diseases into very manageable chronic diseases with minimal or no symptoms. HIV is a great example of that since the 1990s, right? We're in a very good place. It's an unbelievable time to be alive in this industry. Now, against that, you've got other factors in society that potentially will mitigate against everyone's ability to realize the full potential of this. Reimbursement issues, cost issues, politics, inequality, inequitable access to health care, insurance issues, the ACA or not the ACA, and so on. So the way I tend to think about this is, as an industry, we are not in a position of luxury to sit at our lab benches and our clinical benches and do great science and great clinical and great regulatory and get these wonderful therapies out there without also spending just as much of our intellectual capital on addressing those other issues. Because if we don't start realizing that that's our responsibility as an industry and it has to be integrated into all the other stuff we're doing, in the end, there's, I think, a huge risk that the tipping point will be that we actually go backward for a while.
Yeah, I agree with that. In fact, I had similar challenge when I thought about tipping point toward what, from what. So I had a similar reaction to the question about whether we're at a tipping point. And I think in some ways, I mean, obviously the climate's changed, as you pointed out, Ron, and there's a lot of challenges in the political realm and the policy realm that we can talk about. But when you really get to the core of it, a lot has not changed that much in the sense that technology is changing, there's a tremendous amount of innovation, but the challenges of running the business are basically the same in the macro sense, in that we need, in the end, to get to novel drugs that benefit patients. And a lot of excitement around the genome, and everybody thought we were going to not only know the mind of God, Remember that? We were going to know the mind of God if we sequenced the genome. But then we would also immediately have all the benefits of knowing that. And still, we're still mining that to determine, what can we actually bring, what benefits can we specifically bring to patients. Now, earlier today, I was in a meeting when I was talking with someone and remembering at a time when I worked for a major pharma company, and the head of research at that time said, "Stop talking to me about targets, stop talking to me about technology, stop talking to me about all that interesting stuff. I need drug candidates." Right? And so ultimately, that's still what we need to do. We've got a lot of different tools for it. We've got a lot of exciting technologies. The challenges from a technical standpoint continue to evolve. But in the end, what we need to do is we need to deliver drugs. We need to deliver therapy. So that's remained the same against a continuing, evolving backdrop of technology and policy, which I agree we need to engage in. I'm sure we'll talk about that. But the fundamentals, the ball we need to keep our eye on is we need to get not just interesting technology and interesting science, but we need to actually get to the therapies, get to the drugs that are going to benefit the patients.
Paul?
I think, to me, one of the most critical things, and I agree with Ron, and on the tipping point, it's how do we look at commercial and bring that back into the clinic? Because we could have a great molecule, but there might not be a marketplace there in the future for it. So how can we learn from all the innovative things that we have and play it forward and use the learnings for commercial to inform clinical and vice versa? And I think that, to me, is going to be one of the critical things to really push it over the edge. It's not about coming up with me toos anymore. It's coming up with something that's going to meet a benefit for a patient in the end game, that's going to be commercially viable, that's going to add to our industry instead of something that, okay, it's slightly better. That's not going to cut it anymore. And I think we have to rely on commercial people going back into the clinical, whether it's phase 2 or phase 3, to tweak what that study might be to get the outcome that we all want. That, to me, is an evolutionary thing that big pharma, R&D sits one way. We're trying to merge them together, but that's kind of what we've been trying to do for a long, long time to really separate ourselves.
Jim?
So I use a different metaphor than a tipping point, and I use the metaphor of a race. And I think that where we are right now is we're in a race between extraordinarily good science, and I think the pace of change of science is ever arching upward because it's global and it's cumulative. So we're always building upon knowledge, so that the learning curve gets steeper to the good. But we're in a race between the very good science and a lot of proposals for some very, very bad policy. And one of those horses is going to win that race. And if the bad policy horse wins, then the innovation really does stop, as Ron says, and goes backwards. And so when we think about these new therapies, the cell therapy, the gene therapy, the curative therapies, and there was a lot of questions asked about payments. If these are going to cost $1 million, how will we pay for them? Can we do it over time? Will we need reinsurance? Will we pay for performance? And all of those questions. And I would submit that the solution to those questions or those problems are really pretty simple. My staff could sit down with congressional staff and figure out how to do those overnight. The technical problems are not difficult. What is difficult is the political problem, and that stems from the fact that members of Congress, many of them, and politicians at the state level as well, look at us so unfavorably right now that they're just not willing to help us, especially when we say we need some help figuring out how to charge $1 million for this drug. Would you be there for us? They're not going to say yes. And so it raises the obvious question is why is it that we're in the position that we are? We've all been talking about this for a long time. But I think the number one issue is the conflict that people have conflated the out-of-pocket costs of the patient with drug pricing. And today's New York Times story about Humira laments the expense of the drug and talks about patients who can't afford to pay for that drug. And that is often the case, but it is something about which we have zero control. What people pay for is determined by their insurance policy. And I believe that we do the patient a great service when we say, especially if you have a chronic and complex disease like MS or like HIV or cancers, it is then that you're going to have to reach into your pocket and pay and find thousands of dollars. And so you can complain about a drug that costs $100,000 a year because a coinsurance requires the patient to pay $30,000. If we were to cut the price in half, she'd have to find 15,000. And if we cut it by 2/3, she'd have to find 10,000. None of that is affordable. And so we cannot price our way out of this dilemma. So at a time when our prices are only increasing by very small amounts, CMS said spending went up 1.3% in 2016. So in a time when our prices are not exploding, what is exploding is the experience of the patient reaching into their pocket, his or her pockets, because of high copays, coinsurance, deductibility, and we're bearing the brunt of that. And we have to get our policymakers to understand. What I say when I talk to members of Congress is, your constituents are not upset about the price of drugs. And they shake their head and they say, of course they are, I get me all the time. I say, no. They're upset about what's coming out of their pocket. And so you need to think about that as opposed to thinking about policies that will only disincentivize investment in the future.
And now everybody's looking at me. You know, Jim, that was really well said, and I totally agree with you. And coming, you know, working in a large pharmaceutical company, I completely agree with you. And I think that I'm going to return just a little bit to a couple of things that were said. You know, Paul, you talked a little bit about some things that struck home with me with regards to commercial, bringing commercial back in and taking what we learn and taking it back into our clinical trials and what's really going to benefit and what's really going to be important when that drug finally makes it to the patients, right? And I think that is seriously very important, and Johnson & Johnson works really hard to have to get rid of the silos now that we're in between the organizations and bring everybody back in order to accomplish that. I think that's something that's really changed or really has become very, very important to the organization over the last sort of 5 to 7 years. But I'm going to return to, I think that we are at such a special point in time because not only do we have the science and the innovation that we're learning and all of these amazing things about biology that we learn all the time now, and it builds and it builds and it builds. But we also now have data science that is allowing us to pull so much more information out of all that data, and we can and so that means that we can pull very, very interesting knowledge that we might not have ever been able to from sequences and from to create new and different diagnostics in order to intercept disease earlier and have an opportunity to cure. But even added to that is the consumerization of healthcare. Because the consumer, it is not just the doctor anymore. It's the consumer, it's the patient. And the patient, you're right, the patient is really upset at the amount of money that's coming out of their pocket now. But they want to know, they want to take part in their own treatment now. And I think that's going to affect a lot of our business right now.
Sure. Ron.
Yeah, just one more observation, which is in a funny way, paradoxically almost, the fact that we have so many better and better medicines coming out is exacerbating the problem, right? So if you are someone with melanoma, right, and you need a PD-L1 inhibitor or a checkpoint inhibitor or some other immuno-oncology drug that might actually be curative and certainly has a good chance of extending your life by far more than could ever have been done before, not being able to get access to that for financial reasons is even more acute and even more enraging, right? Because if you were talking about 20 years ago when we were giving people what we used to call, fondly on the wards, we would have nicknames for chemotherapy. There was VP16, we would call it voodoo poison 16, remember? And Adriamycin was the Red Death. So you had these horribly toxic medications, and if people couldn't get a hold of them, well, it's not as enraging as it is now. When you have really, in some cases, miraculous treatments, and we'll have more and more miraculous treatments coming out, and at the same time, people are having a harder and harder time, to Jim's point and others, paying for it and getting access to it. So that is a collision course. That's a freight train going this way and a freight train going this way, and before they completely collide, we need some solutions to that.
And by the way, it doesn't take very much money in terms of out-of-pocket cost to destroy adherence. Very little, few number of dollars. If a patient can't get a hold of them, they don't continue to take their medicine, and the cost to the healthcare system is staggeringly more than if they didn't have to pay that out of their pocket.
Yeah, and the political problem, I think, as you point out, if you can't get that drug or your mother can't get that drug, the macro situation, the macro requirement to incentivize innovation doesn't matter a bit. And so when we make the arguments, as we often do, to policymakers about the need to incentivize innovation, I mean, everybody, you can love it in the abstract, but in the concrete example, if you can't get access or your loved one can't get access to the drug, the theoretical support for benefit of innovation, it doesn't matter. And so, as Jim said, we often talk to politicians. In fact, Jim and I were together with our local Maryland Maryland senator recently, and he said, look, people are coming into my office all the time talking about the problem of how much they have to pay for drugs. And that's the problem that we have to help them solve, because we can't solve it on a theoretical basis. We can't we have to have policies that do incentivize innovation fundamentally, but if we try to take that line, it doesn't help the politicians who have to solve that constituent problem. So that's why I think the policies that Jim's outlining, or the line of thinking that Jim's outlining, is so critical to really bring to the debate, so that people understand it, so policymakers understand that it's not about the price, but rather about what the patient needs to incur.
So we've talked a little. We've talked a little bit about the reasons for excitement and optimism. We've also talked about some reasons for concern, and even begun to talk about some of the solutions, focusing on out-of-pocket, focusing on research and development to make sure that it's really responsive to medical needs and produces meaningful advances. I'd love to just pause for a moment and ask Jim to talk about the political pressures, because I think in order to really take the next step of talking about what we're going to do to make sure that the sector is well positioned to innovate into the future, we need to understand those political pressures. And Jim, I think it would be great for the audience to hear your views on what the leadership is thinking of focusing on. We know they need to find a lot of money after the tax bill got passed, so they could be looking at some areas that could really affect us. And if I might, I'll also just ask you about the Robert Pear article that came out in the New York Times just this weekend, which pointed out that there is tremendous enthusiasm on the Hill for finding public funding for research, while at the same time we know that the atmosphere around some of the policies that affect industry has been very negative. So maybe you could talk a little bit about where legislators' minds are at this point.
So let us start with the President of the United States. As you know, in the course of the campaign, we had the Martin Shkreli thing, which led Hillary to make her tweets, which tanked the market by 20%, biotech market. President Bernie Sanders, of course, was singing the same song, and then Donald Trump began to sing the same song, and miraculously, for some strange reason, at his very first press conference, out of the clear blue sky, he started talking about pharmaceutical companies getting away with murder. So his rhetoric has been awful when it comes to our industry. The good side, though, is that his appointees have not been awful. So Scott Gottlieb, as FDA director, couldn't find a better person in the world to do that job. He's a terrific guy. And not just falling over for us. I mean, really helping to accelerate the pace of approval of generics. The new nominee for HHS Secretary, Alex Azar, taking a lot of heat, and will take a lot of heat in his confirmation hearing because he came from Lilly and the Humira and all of that. But he gets our industry. He will not recommend policies to the president that are going to thwart investment in our industry. We at Bio have been extraordinarily busy meeting with all of the president's critical appointees, and to a person, they understand our industry, they understand what is good policy and what is bad policy, and so I don't expect, the problem is that as long as the president keeps saying, I want something done about this, they're going to continue to tie themselves in knots trying to figure out how to make the president happy without hurting our industry. And we've given them a number of good areas to do that. And we think in the State of the Union address, he's actually going to take some credit for accomplishing some things that might take some of the heat off. The other thing that has happened, though, is because nothing has happened in Congress that is detrimental to our industry, with the possible exception of the halving of the deductibility of under the Orphan Drug Act in this latest tax package. But because nothing else has happened, the state legislators all around the country are wanting to get in the act, and they're coming up with all kinds of proposals. And we at Bio are putting out fires in I think 26 states right now. We're looking at in terms of the policies that we have to defeat there, and that's a lot of a lot of fires to fight all at one time. But so far we've been pretty darn successful. I do think that that you will see this out-of-pocket, and I'm Johnny One Note on this point. A lot of discussion at the state level on out-of-pocket costs, because if you are a state legislator or you're a member of Congress today, and you get letters and calls and emails from your constituents complaining about what they spent at the drugstore or what their hospital bill came out of their pocket from their hospital bill, you don't have any. Having held office for 24 years, what you do is you say to your staff, I want you to compose a letter that says, Dear Mrs. Smith, thank you for your letter. I feel your pain. That's why I am co-sponsoring this bill, leading this charge. Well, every bill in every legislator and in Congress that could possibly be used to respond to that issue is contrary to our issues, to our interests. It's all about price controls and things of that nature, and transparency bills and so forth. So the fire comes in from the constituents to the politicians, and then the fire comes back to the constituents, and it's all against the ultimate interest of the patient. So California is one of the few states, if not the only state, that actually enacted a cap on out-of-pocket expenses. It's not a heavy cap. It's $250 per month per prescription. But we've done an analysis. We've had a consultant do an analysis of the impact of that cap on drug prescription benefits, and it's negligible. The people who calculated the premiums for California and in other states didn't even take that into consideration because it was so de minimis. So I do think that the impact on premiums of some kind of out-of-pocket price controls, cost controls, will have negligible impact on the cost of premiums. Final point on NIH. The good news is that there is broad bipartisan support to continue to increase funding for NIH. The bad news is that too many members of Congress continue to think that's the answer to innovation. They think that, well, we give all this money to the NIH funds all this research, and then you companies take that research and tweak it a little bit and gouge little old ladies. And, you know, not understanding whatsoever where all of the risk is and where all of the innovation occurs on the applied side. So that's an issue on which we have to continue to preach to the new members of Congress.
I do have some optimism politically, however, and it's because of the success that Bio has had fairly recently in the passage of the 21st Century Cures Act. Because in the past Congress, it was one of the very few things that got bipartisan support. Complex piece of legislation, covered many different aspects of drug development, and got bipartisan support and was signed into law. And I think net on net was good for us. And Bio was a powerful force in getting that through. Now Congress changed and politics changed, and I know that things go up and down as far as that goes. But in the context of what was a very divided political environment, I think I felt encouraged by the fact that what we do is so valuable, and it's recognized as being so valuable that it was possible to get bipartisan consensus around a set of policies to help us. And I think that, you know, I do kind of harken back to that as what is possible in the policy arena, because policy does really matter. Policy affects us in a lot of ways that many of us have lived through. But that was, I think, a really great example of what is possible, and sometimes in a bipartisan way, because what we do is so important and is recognized as being important.
Can I be provocative?
I've been waiting. Go ahead.
Just show of hands, how many of you think that, on the whole, our industry charges too much for our products? couple of brave people raised their hands.
And the rest of you are liars,
And the rest
apparently.
of you are lying. Yeah. Yeah. Now, if we did that survey, and it has been done with the American public, you'd get probably the opposite ratio of what we just saw here. You'd get over 90% of the American public saying we charge too damn much for our drugs, for our products. 2 people in this room raised their hands. So I think that's a sign that we have a disconnect with the majority of the American public out there. How many of you have been at a family or friends gathering and been challenged by a friend from another who doesn't work in our industry about our prices? Looks like most of the people in the room. Case in point. So one of the things that I reflect on is that as an industry, even now, I don't believe that we have been particularly introspective. I think we've maybe given some lip music to the issues, but I don't think we've been particularly introspective. Now, having said that, I agree with Jim, because if you look at the big picture, we spend something like $3.2 trillion a year, 18% of GDP, on healthcare in this country. We don't get measurably better health across the board than other countries, and in some cases worse in the developed world, but that's what we spend. We spend on average about twice as much on healthcare here as a percent of GDP that other developed countries do. Drugs are, depending on how you're counting it, let's call it $400 billion out of the $3.2 trillion, all right? So what is it, 14%, 15%? It's something like that, okay? Not inconsiderable, that's a lot of money, but let's face it, when we're talking about a system where insurance and government insurance is paying for most people's care, right? The big nut is hospital care, it's office visits and so on, and drug costs are in there as well. But there's an issue where, on the one hand, if you look at the big picture, we are not contributing the lion's share to the issue where insurance is not covering people's drug costs and causing them to pay 20, 30%, or even $500 or $300 for a prescription or whatever it is. On the other hand, we have at a minimum a major perception problem, and I don't believe we've addressed it. And just asking, that little straw poll in this room tells me that we're still not addressing it, because we can talk all day long about the rebate system, which is absolutely correct. You know, we give away 20, 25, 30% of our list price to the PBMs and the rest of the system, and everyone's profiting off it. All of that is true. And when we have drugs that have list prices of $150,000, $300,000, $500,000, $1 million, I think it's incumbent on us as an industry to figure out how we are going to talk about that in a reasonable, rational, and acceptable way to the American public and the government and the media, right? And I don't know that we have yet found that. We're talking about value-based, and how do you talk about value-based? I will give you one example, and then I'll let someone else follow up, that struck me as really interesting recently, and that was the way that Spark prepared the way for Luxturna, which is their gene therapy for blindness, right? It's not a miracle in the sense that it doesn't immediately take all these kids and make them see 20/20, but it is a miracle in that it takes a lot of these kids and turns them from functionally blind into functionally not blind. That's pretty much of a miracle, and it's going to get better over time. You know that. So everyone was talking up front about $1 million a treatment, right? And everyone was shocked and stunned. I think they did an amazing job, and everyone in the industry should study their playbook for what they did. They did an amazing job of, first of all, raising expectations higher than where they came in. So they didn't come in at $1 million, they came in at $850,000. And more importantly, their CEO and others were out all the time presenting the value proposition. And one of the value propositions was, hey folks, look at hemophilia treatments, which you don't think twice about, these poor kids and people who are bleeding all the time and they have to get infusions of blood factors and clotting factors. You know, for a lifetime, that's probably $100,000 or more a year. So over time, it's millions of dollars just for those treatments, let alone the hospitalizations and the bleeding for those patients. Here you have a one-shot treatment, $850,000, and we're getting into risk-sharing arrangements, which if it doesn't work, we refund the insurance company some of the money. So those were their playbook. We should be studying that, and I think as an industry, every time we bring a new drug out, we ought to be preparing the groundwork in a similar way.
Paul, do you want to jump in on that?
As you start looking at outcomes, it's not only pricing, but once you get it in their hands, how are you going to keep them adherent to the therapy if it's chronic? And it's the wraparound services that we all provide that gets lost in the washout. People don't think of that as the added benefit that that company is providing them, whether it's a nurse calling them, showing them injection training, or any of the other compliance to make sure that they're being adherent to it, that gets lost. And we've done a disservice to ourselves saying we're too focused sometimes on acquisition. Let's keep people on these products long term.
So the punchline, I forgot, the punchline to my story was that after they brought it out with the price, people as opposed in some ways to sort of drug pricing policy and so on, as Steve Miller, the CMO of Express Scripts, which is one of the biggest PBMs out there, he came out and publicly complimented Spark and said, yes, it's expensive, but the value is there.
So every time I hear someone say, as Ron sort of just did, we're not doing a good enough job explaining to people why our drugs cost so much. It always hurts me a little bit because that's a big part of my job to get that, to accomplish that.
Not why they do, but why they should.
Well, but here's the thing. It is impossible to explain to the public why our drugs cost what they do. Because if you wanted to make that explanation, you have to go into the investment market, you have to explain why drugs are innovated, 57% of them in this country as opposed to other countries where they cost less. You have to explain the cost of development, you have to explain 90% failure rates. It's an explanation that is far too complex and too long to convince the public of. And so when members of Congress will say to me, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm at a town meeting and somebody complains about what they pay for drugs, and I can't explain all of that, even if I know that you're right. I can't explain all of that. And I say, don't. Just say, who made you pay that much money for your drug? Yeah. Right. And the answer will be, well, I guess my insurance company did. And then you can turn the subject to something that actually might have an answer that they can understand.
That's true, and what then happens is their insurance company goes to them and says, well, the reason we have to do that is their prices are astronomical. You can see that. I mean, my God, $150,000, you can buy a house for what it costs you to take that drug for a year. And then we wind up with the issue.
And then the response to that is, well, when you go to the hospital, you pay maybe 5% copay, and you go to the drugstore and you pay 30% copay. So your hospital bill also is the size of your mortgage. You just don't have to pay as much of it.
So we all, I think everybody on this panel has been engaged in that value discussion for a long time. As Jim said, it is an incredibly difficult one because the right talking points are very, very complicated talking points, and the bad talking points are very easy, very impactful talking points. So I share Jim's our job as California Life Sciences Association is to advocate for policies that advance drug and other medical product innovation in the state of California. And so this is what we do all day, all year. And we know how complicated it is. Getting back to our concept of being at a tipping point, I'd really love to have even more conversation about how we change that dynamic. And I think one of the things that just came out, Jim, with your comments was the importance of broadening the conversation, the importance of making sure that drug costs, which are often the most visible part of the healthcare reimbursement system to patients, are put in context. Maybe you could talk just for a moment about some of the things that Bio has done to deliver that message and what, in your view, still needs to be done to get that point across.
At the risk of talking too much, I'll try to be brief. So we've had a campaign going on for a couple of years now, and there are fundamentally two aspects to it. The first is let's redirect the conversation so that the conversation is not just about drug pricing, but it's about the value that you get for what you pay for. It's about the role of the PBMs. It's about the role of the insurers. So we broaden and make the conversation more intelligent and more significant. So we do that. It's a very complicated thing to do. We do it through mass media. We do it, but ultimately it's about getting to policymakers. We are on the Hill all day long, every day, with a whole army of consultants and staff who are constantly educating the members of Congress, and they turn over rapidly. So I make it my job to meet every single new member of Congress every 2 years and introduce them to biotechnology, introduce them to the concepts and the policies, and help to educate them. And that's an important thing that we're doing. The other thing is to develop champions. We'll find those members of Congress who, particularly if they come from areas where biotechnology is critical. And it's interesting, if you look at San Francisco, you look at Boston, you look at other places where biotechnology is so focused, not all of the representatives from those areas are very supportive of the industry because they tend to be pretty blue, liberal areas. But there are champions in the Congress who will take up our cause, and we bolster them with information. We support their reelection so that we do have some rational voices on the Hill.
All right, thank you. So we have the opportunity, as Sarah said at the beginning of the session, for you all to ask questions. I'm going to ask a few more, but I just want to put you on notice that we're going to move into the interactive part of the discussion. So I know you will be provocative. Please get your questions ready and submit them to Slido. Maybe I could turn to you, Leslie, specifically because the current environment for development stage companies, as robust as it is, as optimistic as we are, is very important to the small entrepreneurial innovative companies that JLab serves. And so I thought maybe you could say just a few words about the environment for those startup companies, which are really the engine for innovation across the sector.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. You know, the last couple of years has been incredibly busy with funding, right? And so we've been, the markets have been open, the private funding, the venture groups have raised a lot of money, they put a lot of money to work. And I think that has really benefited a lot of the companies that have gotten started. And so you're finding that there are a lot of groups, a lot of private funding mechanisms that are going deep into the academic environments to find really interesting science and bring it forward and move it toward new solutions for patients. I think that's super exciting, right? And we had years where that wasn't happening. The other thing that you've seen is there are more and more corporate organizations like our venture group, and now even more from some of the tech companies that are coming into the healthcare arena. And I think that is also super exciting because you're bringing now, you're bringing strategic money coming in with advice, with being able to educate these entrepreneurs further forward from just their exciting new innovations, but bring them forward with the advice that the strategic money is bringing. And you're getting cross-fertilization of tech and healthcare. And I think that's also bringing brand new solutions to some of these entrepreneurs, new thought processes, new ways of doing things. And I think that will also help to speed things up in terms of getting solutions to patients and consumers. And I am super excited and optimistic about how the larger companies are actually taking that pre-competitive view and saying we can work together to educate and help these early entrepreneurs move things faster, because we don't have to worry about all that pre-competitive stuff. We can actually work together on all of those things. And then once it comes to a solution, something that the big companies are better at pulling, then they can fight over it.
I do think one of the things that we're seeing is very similar. The small companies want us to come and develop an entire plan for them. And providing that experience, that flexibility, and that quality that they would get. So in a way, we're competing against each other in really showing them a different way to look at what their end result might want to be. Do they want to be acquired? Do they want to do it themselves? But most importantly, how do we get that innovative medicine into the hands of those patients to be able to drive it? So I think it's a lot of companies looking holistically at how do I do this better, faster, less expensive to be able to make sure it gets in the right hands.
Yeah, and we work really hard at trying to make sure that we're making the connections, right? That we are pulling in people from all over our community and our ecosystem and making them meet each other and learn from each other so that we can get this to happen faster.
One of the things that's really fascinating to me hearing this conversation is so much reflection on an entire industry, which is pre-revenue. And I mean, admittedly, I know you're part of the industry, the pharma part, and you've got a product also, but I don't know what the % of companies is that's pre-revenue, but it's very high in our industry. Really, the bulk of the biotech side of it is pre-revenue. And that's kind of an amazing thing. You know, I have that conversation often with friends of mine who don't work in the industry to try to explain how companies can go public with no revenue, and then how can a stock price value keep going up with no revenue? You mean no products? People ask me, how many products do we have on the market? None. Well, then how come your stock price has gone up? I mean, these are things that are really fascinating when we think then of what we depend upon in order to create value. Because what we're really doing is we're creating, at least for many, many years, for most of us, we're creating perceptions of value, or we're creating perceptions of the likelihood of eventually getting to the point of having that product. So it's a perception of value, and so that's why these, you know, the trend and the environment around the industry, the trends in the environment around the industry are so important, because we can't just, most of us, we can't just turn and say, well, you know, regardless of what's going on in the outside world, you know, my profit's up 20%, because in fact we rely so much on our value based on these trends that are going on, these expectations, these perceptions that are going on outside of our companies.
You know,
I was just going to say, I used to say, as in corporate development of a small company, I used to say, I'm selling a hope and a dream.
Right.
So, you know, while you were talking, what I was thinking, my thought balloon was Alnylam this year. Yeah. So Alnylam's been working for 15 years, something like that, to try and get their RNA interference to work and so on. And in the space of 1 year, if you followed them, you saw their stock price go down by 2/3 earlier in the year, when they had a couple of high-profile product failures. And by the way, no revenue, no products on the market. This is all on the come, right? And now, I forget where they are, 13, 15 billion. I've actually lost track. But then they had a success at the end of the year, and everything is skyrocketing for them now. So, but that's just a case, just classic case study of what you're talking about, and why people invest in our industry, even though the vast majority of the companies that everyone invests in will never see a successful product.
All right, I know that Sarah number two,
they're coming in.
Has some questions.
You can continue to send them in. So we'll start with, I don't think, one of our audience members said, I don't think all drug prices are inflated, but there are examples, and one of the examples given was EpiPen. Does the industry need to do more to denounce rogue companies? It's a delicate one.
Well, I'll start with, so when Martin Shkreli did what Martin Shkreli did, I happened to be with the delegation in China, and we had an emergency executive committee call. It turns out that Turing had just joined Bio maybe 6 months before in order to get a discount to one of our meetings. And so we suggested that we immediately throw them out of our organization. And someone appropriately said, well, you know, where's the line you know, where's the line? And my response was, I don't know where the line is. I just know he's on the wrong side of it. So we did do that. Of course, it's not possible for an industry to take a position on what our pricing increases should look like. That's antitrust. So even if we were to say, as an association, let's all agree to not increase prices by more than CPI. If we did that, we'd go to jail because it wouldn't look like, oh, look at the nice thing they're doing. They're trying to hold their prices down. What it would look like to the Justice Department is, oh, they've all colluded to increase their prices by 4.5% a year or something like that. So it's a very difficult thing for each company, I should say, needs to be responsible for managing its own pricing regimen, and there's not much more than we can do about that.
Yeah, and I will say we did, because I was serving as chair at Bio with Jim at the time, and we had that call, and we had a very robust discussion, and people on the phone were nervous because they said, look, if we do this and it's public, then they're all going to come and say, well, you're hypocrites because that member raised their price on this and that member raised their price on that. And at the end, actually, Jim's comment was, I think you specifically said, it's like pornography, we know it when we see it. And we all agreed that we know it when we see it, and this was it.
I've never seen it, though, but so.
And the rest of it we were going to deal with later. But we have taken stands more globally, more generally, on, for example, the need to show value. And we built that into principles that we expect all members of Bio to sign up to. The need to focus on value, to express value in our pricing and elsewhere. And also, we've taken a stand on keeping strong exclusivity protections, but once they are up, also supporting a robust pathway to generics coming on the market. Because our view, and Bio's expressed view, is that that's what gives us all the headroom to get the high returns on innovation that we need to keep innovating, because when you get cheap generics, that frees up capital to pay for the new branded drugs. So that's the way it ought to work, and we think that we as an industry ought to be supporting both sides. Robust generics and biosimilars, by the way, coupled with robust protection for intellectual property for the designated period of time so that the whole system will work.
I think it's also, when I'm confronted with that question, I say that there is a difference between companies that have a mission of research and development and companies whose acquisition strategy or other business practices are really focused solely on revenue, and they do not intend to plow that money back into an ongoing research enterprise.
Right, and I do remember in these episodes when this has happened, the executives of most of the major pharmas scolded in a very mild way. It was often just exactly the conversation that you guys were saying, right? Talking about value, talking about the fact that, you know, we have to bring things back into R&D and making all of these value arguments without basically blaming. And so, but it did create the conversation. Absolutely, it creates so I think actually we do scold them and call them out, but it's done in a gentle way.
Okay, we have a few more questions to get through in maybe about 5 to 6 minutes. So one of the questions, and I think this is going to be challenging to answer, what is the sweet spot for market size and drug price to determine which drugs move faster? I don't think anybody can answer that, huh?
Which drugs move faster?
Yeah. What is the sweet spot for market size and drug price to determine which drugs move forward faster? It's probably not answerable, is it?
Well, I'm hearing that as a question about what drugs can you best invest in to get to a return, maybe? I don't know.
I don't know.
But you know, I think that one of the issues that we have thought about often within the industry is how do you know, the economics of drug development really matter as far as what money we're able to raise. And to the extent that there's a bigger pot or a faster way to get there, those are the drugs that you can raise more money for more easily.
And I would say there's an ecosystem, so there's plenty of room for different business models depending on your indication, your disease area, the type of drugs you're developing. I don't know that there's a one answer to that because it really is specific to your particular business model and your particular technology and target indication. You can have a broad, mass market primary care drug for diabetes, let's say, or obesity, that doesn't cost a lot per treatment on a relative basis, but is a huge market because of the market that it's addressing. You can have super orphans, like Sterna, 850,000 for a couple of thousand patients. That's also a substantial market. And how fast it moves, well, that depends on whether you get breakthrough status and the nature of it. It does, but bear in mind also, we don't need every single drug that we invent to be breakthrough. There's a role for incrementally better drugs that aren't necessarily breakthrough.
I do think that if you're looking at speed, whether it be in the CRO or on the commercial side, there's ways to shorten that timeline to do that study, to get it out 3, 6, 9 months, 12 months before, and maybe operationally, commercially, 3 to 6 months sooner by condensing and consolidating.
Right, yeah, I think in this case we're missing the situation that's specific.
Yep.
So
and actually, could I take a moment and, Rachel, if I might ask you about rare disease research, getting back to our tipping point, inflection point concept. We had some wonderful provisions for fostering rare disease research in the 21st Century Cures Bill that you mentioned, yet the tax reform bill did cut the tax credit for qualified clinical testing expenses in half. With your experience in rare disease research, what do you think the environment for rare disease research will be in the near future?
I want to make a comment that's slightly different from maybe, but building on what you're asking is, because one of the things that strikes me as you go through those list of benefits and challenges in rare disease research is the fact that policy matters so much to us. And you've gave a couple of examples in the rare disease space, but thinking a bit more broadly about how public policy can affect what we're doing, even in the pre-revenue stage of companies getting, before we start thinking about things like reimbursement. I'm thinking of things like the Jobs Act, things like the PDUFA legislation that made breakthrough therapy possible, things like the tax reform bill now that's repatriating a bunch of money that may make M&A increase, which may make it easier for all of us to raise money. And I think, we are in the rare disease area and also pre-revenue, and so we benefited from the Jobs Act. That helped us to get public. We did get breakthrough therapy status for one of our drugs last year, which made it possible for us to raise a lot of money, so now we can actually do the clinical trial to see if it is in fact a breakthrough. And I hope that by the pharma industry having more money, it's going to make it easier for all of us to raise money that we need in our company. So that's a bit of an indirect way of answering, but I think that the point I would make is that policy changes really do matter for us, and that's why the work that Bio is doing, I think, is so important, even though it may seem kind of abstract when you think about a given policy. I think tangibly and in a very meaningful way, it really does make a difference in how we can run our companies.
Okay, so one of our other audience members sent in a question about performance-based drug pricing, and their question is, will this help the adoption of innovative new therapeutics?
Well, I think the answer is yes, it will, because if you're going to have a curative drug that is valued at some very high number, throw around the cost of $1 million, and you're going to figure out a way to pay for that over time or to pay for performance, it does take some adjustments that are fairly technical in policy. So for instance, if you're not going to pay the entire amount in the first installment, you don't want that to look like the low price for Medicaid, from which you now have to discount that by 23% for the entire treatment. So there are, I think that those kinds of things, I mentioned reinsurance, I think those kinds of policies are going to be, we are going to have to change the paradigm for pricing and reimbursement. But as I said, it's not, the devil is not in the details of how to do that, it's in the details of the politics surrounding it.
Yeah, okay. And I agree. The answer is yes. It provides a methodology around which you can begin to have constructive conversations across the table between drug innovators and managed care, insurance companies, PBMs, and so on, whereas prior to that, too often, we're on opposite ends of the table shooting at each other. So this provides a path forward where we can collaborate, and in fact, I would advocate for us as an industry to be investing a lot more in creative ways of value-based payments. And Bio is working to try to get legislation to help do that and so on and so forth. So to me, that really is a way forward. It's just in its infancy, but a lot of insurance companies are jumping on board, and we need to promote that because that's where it's at. The alternative I see is we'll wind up like the UK with NICE, right, which is not so nice. And that essentially is like a communist-controlled economy, where you have one methodology that says this is how you establish value for every single drug, regardless, and it either passes muster or it doesn't. For those of you who remember Greek mythology, there was Procrustes, who was the innkeeper who had only one size bed, and if you were too tall, he'd come in at night and cut off your feet so you'd fit the bed, and if you were too short, he'd put you on a rack and stretch you so you would fit the bed. I think the value-based frameworks that we see, ICER and others, the Sloan Kettering, Abacus, they are sincere, well-meaning attempts to get at this question of value. My fear about them is that if we cede the ground to any one of them, they become the de facto controller and determinant of what should any drug cost, regardless of other considerations. So to me, a better way to go about it is a market-based way, which is the market participants get together and say, let's try this, let's try that, and in this way we'll get at answers that are more beneficial in the end to patients.
And just to jump in on what Ron was saying, and also Jim was saying, in order to really make that happen, there need to be some legislative regulatory changes, specifically at the federal level around the rules that govern communication between manufacturers and insurers. And I know Bio's working very hard on that, as is CLSA.
So I think our last question will be the following from one of our entrepreneurs in the audience. Given the current environment, what advice would you give to an emerging biotech company with a promising lead asset to develop?
I think the big advice is really, what do you want to be when you grow up? How is this product going to transform, and is it truly innovative?
Those are questions, not advice.
And really, what is that plan to be able to make sure that that becomes really the answer that that company is looking for, and most importantly for the patients. And I think you have to go back to look at the clinical stuff and how clinical can inform the commercial aspect to be able to drive all that.
Make sure your value story is in place, right?
Yeah, and I'd be, if I were doing it, I'd be very general, much more general. I'd say, if you believe in your idea and you believe in what you're doing, you believe in your science and the product and its potential, persevere. Just persevere. Because that's the entrepreneurial rule, right? You're not going to be the smartest person in the room ever. Well, maybe in the room, but not the smartest person in your universe ever. There will be people who are better and swifter and faster, and companies who know it better, and so on. But what you can do is refuse to give up, and just through sheer cussedness, figure out over time how to come back from the inevitable setbacks and get to where you want to go. So start out, if you're passionate about what you've got, believe in it and go with it, and don't let anyone tell you different.
Yeah, and congratulations, because that's an exciting place to be. And I remember when we were starting Glyco feeling that, I remember being there too, and it's a wonderful place to be. I would add to the idea of perseverance, be focused and flexible. Focused because you really can only do very few things right and well, and you really have to, you can't be doing 10 things, you can only do a small number of things, but be flexible, because you may think this is what needs to happen, and in fact what might need to happen is this, and you're only going to learn that over time. So focused and flexible. And one other one, think very, very carefully about the people that you surround yourself with, because that will be the most critical decision that you make. You can tell for sure right now that things will not go according to plan. Whatever you do, things will not go according to plan. So the key managerial, entrepreneurial question, I think, often is, Therefore, who is going to be with you around the table when they don't go according to plan, figuring out what you're going to do? You know, and so getting that core group of the right people is absolutely critical.
You might consider making a plan with things you don't want to happen in it, because nothing in your plan is actually going to happen. So that will actually help you.
Yeah, we do know this from experience.
Backup plans for backup plans and backup plans for that.
My advice would be join Bio.
Yes, absolutely.
Or CLSA.
And CLSA, right.
I would like to, if I can just offer a final thing. Ron asked you a raise of hands of who has approached you in a family meeting or at work or elsewhere about pricing, and most of you raised your hands. But what I have found is that most people aren't feel that they're equipped with all of the right facts and figures. So I would like all of you to take out your smartphones right now. Take them out. Take them out. For those of you who have been checking your emails while I've been talking, that should not take long.
That doesn't happen when you speak, Jim.
Go to text, and I want you to text to 52886. 52886. That's the 2, and the message is bio, all caps BIO. And when you send that text, a couple of things will happen. You'll receive some of our tools and talking points and information. But equally importantly, you will now have joined Bio Action, and when we have a critical issue, an advocacy issue, based on your zip code, you'll get a message from us that says, if you'd like, it would be helpful if you would forward this message to your elected officials, because we can't, if we're going to win this race between very good science and very bad policy, we need every single person involved in our industry to be part of the solution. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Hear, hear.
Okay.
So I think, Sarah, is that we need to...
Yeah, we're
okay.
squeezing the outer limits of it, but thank you. This has been a great discussion, and
So,
there is no question it could go on for another hour or 2 or 3.
So I don't know if we've come to a consensus on the question of whether we are at a tipping point. I certainly think we're at a tipping point. Just to back up what Jim said, you know, policy is absolutely critical in shaping the environment that we face. I will shamelessly take moderators' opportunity to ask you, if you have not explored membership in the California Life Sciences Association, which does at the state level what Bio does at the national level, please do that, because the strength of our advocacy is absolutely dependent on making sure that our membership represents you, so that we can bring that full force of the innovative sector to the attention of our opinion leaders and legislators. So I want to thank really an extraordinary panel. Thanks for your contributions and for your comments.
And thank you, Sarah.